I had the impression that I was going to be speaking mainly to a group of young Thayer School's engineering students today. And I see that I was mistaken in that. I picked a topic which I thought would appeal and be useful to a group of engineering students. And since I've gone to all the trouble of making the slides for it, that's the speech I'm going to give. I'll try to do it quickly so that if you are interested in something else, you have a chance to talk about it. As you may know, I have very eclectic interests. I've spent the last almost 50 years thinking about the long-term causes and consequences of physical growth on this planet, population, environment, climate change, and so forth. And being a professor in kind, if not in practice anymore, I'm willing to speak about anything. So if you want me to pontificate on one of those things, you can get up and ask an appropriate question, and then I'll head off. But today we're going to be talking about fracking. Fracking is, as you know, a shorthand for fracturing, which is a technology that has become widely used over the last decade or so to produce oil and gas in the United States. Fracking was brought into widespread practice by George Mitchell, a Texas gas guy with whom I actually worked closely back in the 70s, although not on fracking, and has now spread and is used widely in this country and has generated an enormous amount of euphoria and, I would say, fantastic thinking about what lies ahead for us. Engineering, speaking now very loosely, is a process by which you figure out interesting new ways to make energy do something different. It's a way of converting energy from one form to another, hopefully making a profit and generating some use in the process. So all of us, and certainly engineers, need to be very concerned about energy. I think, and I hope I'll bring you to the point of view, that there are a large number of profoundly dangerous, wrong ideas abroad these days about fracking and its implications for our country. And irrespective of whether I'm right or wrong, fracking is going to have an enormous consequence for the energy system of this country. At the very least, I hope I can give you some data and some vocabulary that will let you think about it and talk about these things better. Some of you I know have a direct personal or business interest in energy. Others are here because it's not a bad way to pass a Friday afternoon. I hope both of you will conclude that it was worthwhile by the end of the day. I'm going to show you a set of slides, 33 slides. I have reproduced them, and I'm eager to send them out. So this is my email address these days. And if you find that these slides are interesting to you, you can write me an email, and I will be delighted to send you a copy of the slides. So that means don't spend any of your time writing down these slides now. There's a half a chance at the end you'll consider it was a waste of time anyway. And if you think they're neat, then you can just get them from me, and that lets you just concentrate on the conversation. Limits to growth of energy, facts about fracking in the U.S. I was asked at lunch why I'm so interested in fracking. Actually, I'm not especially interested in fracking, except indirectly. I'm interested in limits to growth. I'm interested in the problems which are caused for this country, for our region, for the globe, by physical expansion of the population and the use of energy and resources. When I start to talk about those problems, often these days somebody says, well, don't worry about that. We're going to take care of it. And if you probe and ask them how they're going to take care of it, almost immediately you get into the issues of new technology, often fairly ill-defined, and therefore energy. It's no accident that this last 40 or 50 years, which has seen phenomenal growth in the technical capacity and the material well-being of our country, has also been a time of phenomenal growth in the use of energy. I think we're coming into a period where the energy available to us is going to start going back down again. And I think that will have consequences for the economy, the well-being, and even the technological capacities of our society. But as soon as you start to get into that conversation, at least in this country, the issue of fracking comes up. And so it's at least important at the outset to have some factual understanding of what we really mean by that word. Fracking is so far principally a phenomenon in the United States. It's psychologically and politically interesting overseas, but I think something like 96% of all the fracking activity in the whole world is currently going on in this country. And there's good reason to believe it's going to stay like that. So by and large, it's a matter for us. Here's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to summarize the 5 main themes which I see when I talk to people and read the media. And just so that you know I'm not putting up a straw man, I'll actually show you some quotes from ostensibly reputable media to illustrate that these ideas are, in fact, abroad. Recently I was at the World Economic Forum in China, and in my group was a vice president for British Petroleum. He and I got into a discussion, and he himself held these ideas. So these are not arcane and remote. This is mainline stuff here. So I'll talk about that. Give you just a very, very quick overview of some salient features about oil production today, mainly fracking oil production. And then I want to introduce a concept, EROI. EROI stands for Energy Return on Investment, and it's basically a very crude notion, qualitative notion, about how much energy, the ratio between the energy you get back out of a process from the energy that you have to put into it. In the old days, initially back in the 20s and 30s, if you would take the energy content of a barrel of oil and put it into pipes and trucks and roads and wells and refinery, all the stuff that you need, put in a barrel's worth of energy, you get back out 100 barrels. The EROI was 100. Fabulous. It's wonderful to have a business where you put in 1 and you get back 100. You can sustain very rapid growth, typically, under those circumstances. And we did. Now, as far as people can calculate, the EROI is around 30, and we're rapidly declining. So we'll talk about that just briefly, because it lies behind this issue of fracking. Fracking is now widely enough practiced that we can get good data on some key aspects of the process, and I'll just summarize a few of them, and then speculate just a bit about what lies ahead. I tend to get wound up when I give these speeches and barrel ahead. So if I don't explain something in a way that makes it understandable, please raise your hand, and I'll try to call on you to ask a question. I may not get into a discussion, but it at least will alert me to the fact I need to do a better job of clarifying what I'm talking about. So first of all, what are the 5 fantasies? Fantasy number 1, the United States has enormous reserves of oil and gas. Centuries of oil and gas. Fracking gives us cheap energy. not too cheap to meter, probably, but it's cheap. And you'll see that. I'll show some statistics. Principally, when people start talking about this, they're referring to gas, not oil. And it is true that today in the United States, gas is a third of what it is in Europe, and it's a fifth of what it is in Japan. But that's not because of the intrinsic characteristics of fracking. There's even talk that the United States is going to become energy independent again. We were at one time the world's largest oil producer. We were for a while the world's largest oil exporter. Now we import about half of our oil. But there is mention in the responsible press about the fact that we can foresee a time when, in fact, we'll again be energy independent. And it's confused a bit because we actually already are a significant exporter of refined oil products, but that's an accident of who has the refineries and who doesn't. This will lead to an industrial renaissance. Full employment, the middle class is going to start moving back up again, the skies will clear, the water will unpollute, and it will be just fantastic. And all of the above will come along with a fundamental shift in geopolitical relationships, the understanding being, of course, that this will be to our benefit. OPEC will no longer, be able to dictate price, and the Russians will have competitors when it comes to blackmailing people and so forth. So these are the 5 main fantasies. Now I'm going to just show that I didn't just make these up. This doesn't come from exhaustive research. It comes from about 5 minutes on the web last night. But but there you go. So U.S. News and World Report a year ago, you see the sheer magnitude of the reserves of natural gas, etc., potentially 100-year supply, fundamentally change the nation's role in the energy security conversation. Other statistics. In 2012, last year, our oil supply showed the fastest growth of any non-OPEC country in the world. We could end up with the cost of energy to U.S. manufacturers returning to what it was in the 60s. That's a fact. Shale gas has boomed and gas prices have come down. So here's from Merrill Lynch, who, of course, is trying to help you figure out what to do with all the money you're going to make from this. You can read it. An economic revival is taking hold, well on its way to becoming energy independent, could last 100 years. And. You don't need to spend much time, and you find these themes repeated over and over again. And, of course, why not? This is good news. There's not a lot of good news in this country these days, and when you see this, it's something you like to talk about. So people do talk about it. Our goal, and I hope I can help you with that today, is to understand how to interpret this information and see what it really means. When people talk about the current situation in relation to fracking, typically what they say is true. It may not be the whole truth, and the causal implications they're making may not even be correct exactly, but the facts are true. When they start to talk about the future, that's a different matter. Anyway, we're confronted with this welter of information, and we need to sort it out and try to figure out what it means. And as some of you know, my penchant is to use, in a case like this, simple games as an opportunity to practice. So I'm going to give all of you an opportunity to practice how to interpret these complex situations. This is a little exercise called secret code. I have invented a secret code, and I'm going to use it to convey numbers to you. And just because we don't have much time, and I want to make it really simple, I will restrict myself to integers and only 5 of them, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, and only one at a time. So it's a really simple situation. So I have invented the code. I'm going to represent the number, and we'll see if you can figure out what it means, okay? What number am I showing you? Don't say it. Just think it in your head. Now, everyone form a number between 1 and 5. What number am I showing you? I'm showing you 5. How many people thought 5? Roughly a fifth. That's good. That's random, but this is a smart crew, and so you're on the steep part of the learning curve, and I'm sure it'll be better next time. What number am I showing you now? I'm showing you 4. Now I'm showing you 3. Now what number am I showing you? Yeah. The code is incredibly simple, unless you keep looking inside the box. If you restrict yourself to trying to figure out what's going on inside here, you never figure it out. Actually, what does happen, in a way that Skinner, the psychologist at Harvard, fully appreciated, you begin to concoct stories which link a random sequence of stimuli to the result. And every time your story doesn't quite work, you add a feature to it. But that's superstition. That's not science. And we need to shift from a superstitious understanding of fracking over to a scientific understanding of fracking. That's what I hope we'll do today. In the period 1970 to 1972, I led a team at MIT in the construction of a computer simulation model which had behind it sufficient hubris to imagine that we were plumbing some of the key causes and consequences of physical growth on a finite planet. A crucial assumption in our work was this curve, which relates what we call the fraction of the initial resource still remaining. So roughly, we started with one of it still remaining. Our model started running in 1900. And in 1900, of all the world's non-renewable resources, roughly 100% were still left. And then as you start to use up the resources, of course, the fraction goes down. And this is the amount of the capital plant in your system that you have to allocate to obtaining resources, finding them, extracting them, purifying them, transporting them, all that stuff, getting them up to the factory door where they're ready for the next stage. I could talk for a couple of hours about how we got this curve. Suffice it to say for the moment, that's what we did. This curve has a couple of interesting features dynamically. One of them is it starts with a very low fraction of capital. And historically, in the United States, we've used like 3 or 4% of our capital stock in the resource sector. Resources have been relatively inexpensive for us. And it stays low for a long time. So if you're an economist who learns about reality through regression analysis, you quickly discover that there's no correlation between depletion and intrinsic cost. Until there is. But if you build your model on this and extrapolate out, you don't get the right answer. We're now in this period. It's extremely difficult to get a good quantitative fix on this because the data aren't kept in this way. They're kept in monetary units. And as we've seen, you can print money as much as you like. Or you can subsidize something for political reasons and make it a lot cheaper than it really is, et cetera. So the data are enormously difficult, really, to gather and put together. There's some anecdotal data, but it's nothing like a rigorous scientific analysis of this curve. Nonetheless, it makes sense to me, and it's the one we use, and so that's going to be what I'm going to talk about this afternoon. When that curve goes into the model, you start to generate scenarios like this. And this is actually a so-called standard run that we did back in 1972. Major physical, this is resources, industry, this is persistent pollution, foods, and so forth. Notice that we did this in 1972, just here, and at that time, we still anticipated there be another 3 or 4 decades of growth. We didn't imagine, suddenly that we were about to fall off the cliff at that time. But what we said was the policies which had brought us to this point, if they were not fundamentally changed, would have the consequence of overshooting and then collapse after the world had grown past its carrying capacity, which we're here now, which is in the next years in this model. In our analysis, we then performed a lot of experiments. We changed the coefficients in order to represent radically improved technology, or amazing new discoveries of renewable resources, or industrial advances which drastically reduced the amount of resources required per unit of output, and so forth, and ran the scenarios and tried to understand what were the central themes. The main thing to know is that more or less whatever realistic assumptions you made about resources in our model, growth stops somewhere between 2020 and 2050. And the dominant way that it stops is to overshoot and collapse, not asymptotically coming into some nice congenial balance with the limits. Back in 1972, this was totally hypothetical. Because that was a period of rapid growth and great progress, huge expectations, 2 cars in every garage, a chicken in every pot. It was going to be fabulous. So we just had to publish it and, and defend it on theoretical terms. Now we're starting to get into a period where you could expect the empirical data to pick this up, although in a different form. It seems to me to have done that with energy. This is a curve which shows the discovery and the use of conventional oil, starting from 1930 and going up until 2050. Each green bar represents 1 year's discovery of oil. The black line represents that year's production or use of oil. And what was happening back here in the 50s and through in this period, in Saudi Arabia, in the Middle East, in other places, they were discovering huge new so-called elephant or giant oil fields, far greater than would be required to support annual consumption, and so they just left it in the ground. Meanwhile, consumption steadily rose until in 1984, for the first time, consumption globally of oil surpassed discovery. But, of course, we had all this accumulated oil that we hadn't used, so we were still able to sustain a growth in production, even though we weren't finding as much anymore. Since 1984, every single year, the world has used more oil than it's discovered. You can do that for quite a while, but you can't do it forever. And so there's some question about what happens out here. But at some point, it's going to have to come back down. unless, well, so at some point production and use and discovery of oil has to be more or less comparable. And the interesting thing about fracking, of course, is that its proponents claim that they have figured a way to plug the gap. It's a big gap. We don't know, of course, precisely what lies ahead, but starting with N. King Hubbard in 1970, up until, say, more recently, the Energy Watch Group in Germany last year have looked ahead and to try to understand about oil. The Energy Watch Group concluded that oil production is going to be reduced by half between now and 1930. It's going to fall to half of current levels because of the constraints on supply. Half. If it were to do that, so you're talking now very roughly 15 terawatt years of energy today. In, if you sort of run everything out, it's going to be 30 in 2050. And if you accept oil is roughly half, 50 to 60% of global energy, and significantly more than that in certain sectors like transportation. But if you accept the Energy Watch Group figures, then the gap is in the vicinity of 17 to 20 terawatts years. And just to put that in perspective, if you built 1,000 megawatt nuclear power plant every day for 50 years and didn't have any problems with them, and didn't shut any of them down, that'd give you 10 terawatts, which is, of course, ridiculous that we would do that, and plus it doesn't work. Anyway, assessing wind capacity, of course, is an extremely flaky enterprise, but, I mean, it's in the vicinity of 2 to 4 terawatts if you really build windmills everywhere. Solar, solar photovoltaic, maybe 20. Biomass has, of course, all sorts of other consequences. I heat my house with wood, but I don't use 7 to 10 terawatts to do it. Yeah.
I have a question. How much terawatts is being used in the whole world at present?
I said 15. That's 15. Yeah. So they're expecting global energy use to roughly double by 2050.
Terawatt is actually 1.5 million or 50.
Well, it's a really, really, really big number, which you get by putting, electricity. I mean, all those things together. I mean, don't run these numbers out to more than 4 or 5 decimal places. But I'm just trying to give you some sort of general impression about it. Okay. Now, of course, our problem isn't simply in the quantity of energy. It's in the available or discretionary energy. If you find some wonderful new technology that takes 10 units of energy to give you back 5, this may be technically fascinating, and it may even be something that could be subsidized on a small scale for political purposes. But it isn't going to run the country. So you do need to think about the payback. We started with energy forms that gave such enormous payback, we really didn't have to think about it. But now we're getting off into a region where we do. And here's some examples. So I said, originally in the old days, oil gave you 100 to 1 payback. Imports are maybe 30 to 1. Now when you start building multi-billion-dollar oil platforms and running them out into the Gulf and shutting them down every time a hurricane is coming past, etc., you're getting down into much lower numbers. Coal is an interesting one because it has such a range. If you take it out of the ground and shovel it into a small boiler with no preventive environmental measures, you get about 80 to 1. That's the way the Chinese do it, and that's why they like coal so much. As soon as you start pulverizing the coal to take out the sulfurs and the solids, and then running it through a fluidized bed combustor, and then trying to, take some of the stack emittance out and so forth, then you're getting down to coal has a very low EROI. Nuclear, something like 10, might be 5, might be 15 or 20, but it's not 80 or 100. And of course, nuclear only gives you electricity anyway. It doesn't give you the other things. Firewood, 25. Photovoltaics, 15 to 45. These numbers are really approximate. I just installed a thermal array on my roof. I don't think we'll ever even pay back the gas that was used in the trucks of the guys who came down to install it. Oil sands, tar, shale, so those things which are supposed to save us, 2 or 3. They're not going to do it, and leave aside all of their environmental problems. Okay. So now this is really crude because the science is just not there yet, but if you try to think what's happening with EROI, it's doing something like this. And I put this red band in here because it takes something around 10 or 12 to run the country. You need an energy system that's generating a return of something like 10 to 1 coming out of the hole in order to run it off into the rest of the society and keep the society going. As soon as the EROI goes below 10 or 12, you're in permanent decline. So that's why shale is so interesting, because it's big. Yeah.
Can you just clarify one thing? When you're saying EROI, the investment, are you talking in energy units?
Energy units. I'm not talking about dollars.
So is it the same as what sometimes seen as EROEI, energy return on energy invested?
They used to write it EROIE, and then it was awkward, so they just say ERI. But it's barrels per barrel, or BTUs per BTU, or joules per joule, or something like that. So in and out. So that's why shale is, because there's a lot of shale. Shale is a tight rock formation permeated with hydrocarbons. We've known about shales for a long time, but it wasn't possible to get anything out of them economically. This is a plot of shale fields in the United States. Notice 5 of them in particular because they show up in the press all the time. Here's the Bakken. This is where everybody's making millions these days, North Dakota has the lowest unemployment rate in the country now, and just added the most percentage to its millionaires last year because everybody's up in the Bakken pumping oil with fracking. Here's the Marcellus. This is the one which is causing all the political nightmares out in New York about people banning it and this and that. Here's the Eagle Ford down here, Fayetteville up here in the middle of Arkansas, and then here's the Haynesville. So there's a lot of other shale fields, but those are the 5 which are really, giving us the thing. And there's shales internationally. Poland got really excited because they have a lot of shale, and so forth. As it turns out, I'll mention this later, the shales in the United States are especially favorable for production. They're thick, they're flat, they don't have a lot of contaminants. In other parts of the world, the shale tend to be folded. And as soon as you're trying to run a horizontal line into a convoluted shale, it doesn't work very well. But nonetheless, when you look at the map, you can start to get excited about it. But we need, before we get too excited, to keep in mind what's really going on. This is what oil production used to look like in the old days. You take a stick out, push it down into the ground, and then jump back. That's Spindletop in 1901. This is what it looks like today. You drill a hole down about 7,000 feet. Then you turn a corner and run it out. And actually, you run these out, in all different directions. And then you push down a special fluid, which has got all sorts of chemicals and grit in it. And then you subject that to very high hydraulic pressures, so it cracks the tight sands, and grit goes out in there and keeps the holes open. and then you have to pump all the liquid back up and put it someplace. And then you wait, and the gas and the oil bubble out and come up. And that's what we're doing now. This is a lot different from Spindletop. Here's the cycle that this typically goes through. This is actually something I captured from a friend of mine, David Hughes, who was a senior fossil fuel geologist for the Canadian Geological Survey for 30 years. He's retired now, and he's writing about these things. First of all, they discover it. I mean, they actually knew it was there before, but they didn't know how to get the stuff out. Now they have the technology, so they rediscover it. Then you need to lease the land. The United States has this very idiosyncratic law that the person who owns the surface of land also owns the resources under it. That's not that way. In most of Europe, the state owns what's under it. But here, we own it. So if Colin is here and I'm here, I can sell the driller access to my land, and Colin could say, I don't want any of that stuff around here. And then the driller just goes down, takes a U-turn, and fracks under Colin's land, takes all of his gas and oil anyway, but pays me. Great idea. And then I'm rich enough to go to Florida, and I don't have to worry about what happens next. Then, once they've leased it, and these leases, incidentally, I'll come back to this in a minute because it's very important. These leases have a very interesting provision. When I lease your land, I promise to start producing, therefore paying you a royalty, right away. If I don't, I lose the lease. It reverts to you. It goes back. So, producer to lose it. So that means that once I have that lease, I have an enormous incentive to start using it. So I, of course, like all good profit seekers, look for the so-called sweet spots, the places where the out is big and the in is relatively small. I identify those sweet spots and I drill them off. Then gas and oil start to come out. Sometimes they're mixed. Some areas are principally gas plays, and some places are principally oil plays. Bakken is principally oil, for example. And then I, sell it. A problem, of course, these days, which is in the news, is that these new fields are in areas which don't have well-developed pipeline infrastructures. So they're starting to use trains to ship this stuff, and then, as you know, they're having problems with the trains. That's, I think, a transient issue, but at the moment, not. So it turns out that, like most of life, the really good parts are in relatively few areas. Or to put it another way, not very much is drastically above average. So you rather quickly saturate those sweet spots. You basically drilled as many holes as you can drill. And then decline sets in. And one of the important characteristics of all the fracked fields, gas or oil, is very, very high decline rates, which I'll show you in a minute. So that's the tortoise cycle. This is what we're doing these days. This is billions of cubic feet per day. And these are all the different fields. And you notice here's that group: Haynesville, Barnett, Marcellus, Fayetteville, Eagle Ford. They are giving us the preponderance of the gas that we're getting these days. And not because we just went there first. That's because we know that's where we're going to get the gas. You will not see Pierre and Hermosa and Utica generating 4 and 5 and 6 billion cubic feet a day. Those simply don't have the capacity to do that.
Why is the Bakken towards the bottom of the major producers?
What is the what?
Why is the Bakken towards the bottom of the major producers? Isn't it one of the bigger?
This is gas.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
As I said, Bakken is mainly liquids, not gas. Here's what the decline looks like, which is what you would expect. in the conventional production, speaking very simplistically, you drill down into a big pool, and then you pump it out. And so you can do that for a long time at a more or less constant rate. Here, you're fracturing the rock and then letting stuff perk out through the cracks. So it comes out a lot at first and rather quickly dies off. And in fact, if you look here, after 4 years, you're down to about 5% of the initial output. Financing of these things generally is predicated on the assumption that it's going to be a much flatter production rate. So people are incurring losses now in anticipation of all the money they're going to make out here. But they aren't going to make it, of course, because they won't be pumping the stuff. So you have this interesting phenomenon. You drill a well, it gushes out, and then starts to decline. So you have to drill another well in order to make up for the first, etc. And if you trace that out in Haynesville, production has already peaked out. And the wells kept going until finally they became uneconomic. Once you get down to this region, you're drilling small enough deposits. Oil and gas guys are smart, and they have good models, by and large, physical models, so they know what they're going to get, and they can make the calculation and know that they're not going to make a lot of money off that well, so they don't drill it. Haynesville is leading the other ones, and now even the International Energy Agency, based in Paris, which used to be incredibly optimistic about this technology, has concluded that fracking is going to peak out in the United States in another couple of years. In anticipation of that, the frackers are shifting from gas-intensive wells to oil-intensive wells. Why? Oil is sold internationally. If you produce a barrel of oil, it doesn't cost you very much to get it to a port, put it on a boat, and you can ship it over to London or to Beijing and sell it. Gas isn't that transportable. You can't ship it unless you liquefy it, and that's an enormously difficult process in many ways. It's expensive, it raises all sorts of environmental concerns and so forth. So the reason we have cheap gas in this country today is not because fracking is inherently cheap. It's not. Actually, these guys are producing gas at about 8 and selling it for 3. They're losing money phenomenally. The reason they're selling it for 3 is because that's the going rate, and the reason that's the going rate is that the price elasticity of demand for gas is low. It takes a while. It takes 4, 5, 6, 7 years to ramp up your electric power plants, to convert your coal-fired utilities over to, etc. So it just takes a while, and in that interim period, the bottom drops out of the price. So what's happened is they've shifted, and this is the number of rigs. You see, it was going up mainly gas, and then reality hit, and so now the number of oil rigs is going down, and they're mainly drilling off in the liquid-rich areas. But this is also a brief interval. It has been effective in the area of gas. We now produce about 30% of our gas in this country from fracking. And you see that it has, this is all fracking here, this has actually turned us back up. And we're now producing more gas than we ever did. This is the 1970 peak that Hubbard predicted. Not true for oil. It's turned a corner, but we're still producing much less than we did. And anybody who starts to talk about energy independence has to bring in some heroic assumptions about energy efficiency and other non-supply side changes in order to make this anything close to being self-sufficient. Here's the history of oil prices. I remember buying gas at a time when there was so much of it, the stations used to have what were called gas wars. 17 cents a gallon for gas. It was great. For a long time, it was a buck. And it's only been very recent, actually. We forget about it. But it's only been, in the last decade, really, that the prices have taken off. Now, this is a price per barrel. And so here's the 2008 collapse. But they rather rapidly came back up. And they're now hovering around $100 a barrel, with no prospect that they're going to come down from that, and every likelihood that they're going to rise significantly above that. Fracking, high prices are good for fracking. Fracking is not good for high prices. This is gas. Here again, the collapse in 2008, steady rise, and now there's this jostling back and forth. Producers are trying to get permission to build liquefied natural gas facilities so they can ship this stuff out. The domestic chemical industry is desperately trying to block exports so that they can continue to have cheap raw materials, and so forth and so on. Let me say, the future of gas prices is personally very interesting to me because I have a lot of stock in gas companies, but I don't imagine that I'm really able to tell you what's going to happen with the gas price. The Energy Information Agency has always been a great booster of the energy system. They have the interesting attribute that they predict future oil production by extrapolating out the data on past oil production. Physical reserves don't enter into the equation. It's fascinating. I mean, you couldn't imagine how they could do that. The reason they could do that is they were founded after the OPEC embargo by the oil importing countries to try to, get things back in order. So they've always focused on the good side. Only very recently, meaning like the last year or two, supply constraints have started to sneak in to their 100-page reports about how much we're going to be producing and using in the future. But even they now are starting to become realistic about fracking. And here are some points, and this is their World Energy Outlook just came out in, I think, December, so last month. They point out that the industrial countries have basically stabilized their energy use. So the real growth is from the less developed countries. Of course, principally China, but Brazil and India and so forth. So the energy demand is shifting over to the less developed countries. The potential for fracking is very much greater in the United States than elsewhere. If you just look at a map of shale deposits, the one I showed you, it does not give in any way an accurate understanding of the potential because the shales in the United States are enormously favorable for fracking in contrast with it, for many reasons. Fracking takes a lot of water. Many countries don't have a lot of water. Fracking is environmentally disruptive, not only because it smells and makes dust, but trucks go by and so forth. We're able to frack in areas that are not densely settled. Most of the other countries, their shales happen to be densely settled. Our shales are relatively flat. Other shales are relatively convoluted. Our hydrocarbon is relatively uncontaminated with impurities that cause problems, and in other countries that's not the case. So we have by far the most potential for this. As I said, they're projecting now that it will be relatively short-term. The major consequence of fracking, I think, 50 years from now, will have been that it delayed our making the basic fundamental changes we need to make on energy efficiency, renewable sources, land use patterns, and so forth. It's given people an excuse for not doing those things, and we'll continue to do that for a while. So I think finally that's going to be the big impact. Over the short term, it is having a big impact. It has reversed the decline of oil production. Some people are making a lot of money from it. Industry, in the petrochemical industry, fertilizers, pesticides, plastics, are starting to rebuild their industrial capacity in the United States because $3 for gas is a really good price as compared with what they have to pay in Europe or in Japan. Japan is really stuck because most of their gas comes from Indonesia as liquids, and they're paying up to around 15 per unit of gas. You see, we're paying roughly a third of Europe and a fifth of Japan. But 10 or 15 years from now, and even still today, the Middle East is the low-cost producer. Saudi Arabia charges $100 a barrel for its oil, not because it costs $100 a barrel, but because the king and his family have built up a lifestyle and a culture of subsidies and transfers which require $100 a barrel to sustain them. Russia now has something like a break-even price of $110 a barrel. I mean, in order to keep their system going. And the other important thing is we're still going to be mainly dependent on oil, certainly in the transport sector, for a long time. This is what they're talking about for future prices. These projections are not useful except in the sort of terms of the general direction. But the main point is it's going to keep going up. And these are current prices. We're in an interesting situation now. In order to coax out of the ground as much oil as we need, we have to pay a price so high that we can't afford it. And people who look at that system anticipate that we're going to be going through a period of oscillations. Oil will come down, people will gear up to use it, building factories and so forth, and then as the demand starts to mount, prices will go back up. And as soon as it gets up around $120 a barrel, you have a depression or a recession. So demand slacks off, etc. I mentioned that it's easiest in the States. I won't go back over that again. Another thing, we have a lot of people in this country who know how to do this. We do have a phenomenal petrochemical industry. Most countries don't. So when you want to, and it takes a lot of people. You don't just do this with computer programs. It takes a lot of people to do this. And we're relatively blessed with those people. And there's a secondary industry, the pipe manufacturers and all that. And, very important, the legal system is relatively stable. If you make a contract here, by and large, you can assume that 5 years from now it will still be the defining instrument. In many countries, that's not the case. And so it becomes more difficult to make big investments in an area where you have to worry about somebody coming it in and taking it from you once you just finally become cash positive. I put in here about the environment. I mean, it causes a lot of damage. These numbers are partial, but 1 trillion liters of water were contaminated in 2012. 410,000 metric tons of pollutants were put into the air. It uses a lot of water. We tend to overlook that, but that's a really crucial factor. Not only that it needs it to do, but then you got to put the water someplace. You either have to pump it underground, in which case it starts to cause little earthquakes, or you have to put it around in ponds or something. It's a real nuisance. What this says, Colorado, the use in Colorado in 2012 was equal to the water used by 200,000 households. What's that mean? Well, I don't know. I mean, it's just, it's a problem. And it emits methane, which, as we know, is a very powerful greenhouse gas. Increases truck traffic a lot because you're trucking in this water, you're trucking out the oil, and so forth. I mean, a lot of trucks are going back and forth. And it does cause earthquakes. This is a matter of research and debate now, but I don't think there's any longer any scientific doubt that it does cause earthquakes. Are they important? Should they outweigh the benefits? I mean, these are issues that still need to be debated. But when you start fracking or pumping stuff under the ground into these areas under pressure, it shifts the geology in a way which does lead to small tremors. Now, you could say, and I think you should say, if it's really this bad, why do we all think it's so good? Because every single major actor in the industry has an incentive to lie. They may be lying deliberately, or they may be spouting something that they consider to be the truth, but it isn't. But when they do that, there's no incentive to correct them because everybody wants the lie to be true. The financial industry makes money off of deals. If you lose money in fracking, you're not going to do very many deals. The guys who run these companies are losing money. They need desperately to keep money coming into the industry. So they need equity, they need loans, or they need to sell off their properties. And they're not going to do that if they tell the truth about what's happening there. The politicians need to lie about it because for the United States to be under the thumb of OPEC and other oil exporting nations is not pleasant. And we need, in our bargaining, to raise the specter that we're going to once again be master of our own domain. So we lie about it, also at the political level. And on and on and on. And I'm not imputing any low moral character to these people. If any of you or if I were in their position, we would also lie about it. I mean, that's what you have to do. That's why there is this very widespread sort of general euphoria about what's going on. But reality is coming. And here, I finished with a couple of quotes. This is from the CEO of Exxon. And they're talking here about fracking. We're all losing our shirts. We're all making no money. It's all in the red. This is project and technology director for Royal Dutch. It's over-fracked and over-drilled. Shell came in late. The big guys all came in late. They bought big properties, overpaid, started to do the numbers, concluded it was a disaster. Now they're selling out, and they're losing a lot of money. And they wrote down $2.2 billion on the Eagle Ford. They paid for the properties. They looked at it, decided they weren't going to make any money off of it, so they sold them off and wrote off 2.2. And this just shows what's happening with prices. The true cost of running these things is high. It is $100 a barrel, so it isn't going to drop the prices down. And here's the last one. This came out of the Wall Street Journal just about a week or two ago. It turns out a lot of the money for the U.S. fracking industry, for the small guys, has been coming from overseas. And now the overseas sources are starting to do the numbers and concluding it's not a very good business. In 2 years, the amount of money coming from overseas into this industry has dropped by 90%. And it's going to dry up. And when the money quits coming in, these guys are going to be very quickly in trouble because they are losing money now. They're certainly on the gas side. I think on the oil side, the problem there is more the one of decline. Okay, so we just need to think about energy in a different way. We need to start, we're going to have energy. There's still a lot of oil under the ground. We are still going to have cars and factories and so forth. We're just going to have to start thinking about this in a different way. We need to develop some new habits. And so I'm just going to end up my speech with a little exercise to help you develop new habits. Cross your arms. Now, everybody look down and see which wrist is on top. This being a very clever crew, I won't have to point out that there's only two possibilities. So it's either your left or your right. So remember which one it is, okay? Drop your arms. Great. Cross your arms. Look down and see which wrist is on top. And remember which one. Okay, now drop your arms. So since we're all scientists here, let's do a little empirical survey. Everybody who had the same wrist up both times, raise your hand. Almost everybody. A couple of you don't actually remember anymore. But hey, let's don't make a stir here. I mean, go with the flow. So let's see what it is. I mean, obviously, you have a habit. You cross your arms. You figure out how to cross your arms. It works, so that's what you do. And so then we have this habit, and we just do it. That's what it is about habits. It's actually great because, why do you cross your arms? You do it when you want to do something that doesn't require your arms. And it would be stupid to spend 5 or 10 minutes every time trying to figure out, what to do with your arms when you don't need them. So you have this habit. It works fine. And in fact, we've developed all sorts of habits related to energy. And they have worked just fine. So let's see what the optimal habit is. Everybody who had the left wrist up both times, raise your hand. Everyone who had the right wrist up both times, raise your hand. See, this is interesting. Half and half. Which means that actually it doesn't make so much difference which way you do it. Either way works pretty well, but you adopt one and then you just quit thinking about it. That's kind of like energy. Actually, there will be other energy options open for us. I was born into a society that used about 10% as much energy per capita per year as we do today. That was the United States back in the 40s. It wasn't so bad. So it can go down, and it won't be so bad in the future. But we just need to practice changing habits. So now we're going to do that. Cross your arms the other way. This proves, see, I have to sort of wind this up, right? So I need a segue. So this proves 3 things which are important to remember about changing your habits. 1, it's possible. Mostly. We will be able to change our habits about energy. We won't consume something that we don't have. 2, you have to think about it. And probably even make a couple of mistakes at first. But then you get it right. We shouldn't imagine that the energy system transition is going to be any different than that. We will make mistakes. And rather than using them as an excuse for stopping, we just need to learn from them and keep moving. And 3, it doesn't feel so comfortable at first. I don't know about you, but when I cross my arms the other way, it just doesn't feel as congenial as it does that other way. And that's the way it's going to be with energy. There will be a lot of people who aren't very comfortable at first, like the oil companies. And that just means that we shouldn't expect we're going to go through a transition where everybody's happy all the time. Some people are going to be very unhappy. They're going to fight viciously to preserve their situation. And we just need to take the big picture and keep going. And if you do that, we'll make it. Thank you. So, I know that some of you need to go. So just get up and don't think you're going to offend me. It's logistically a little tricky, but it's not offensive. And then we're going to wait for about 20 seconds until they've sort of gotten out, and then I'm at your disposal. Those who leave just shouldn't talk until they get out of the room. Okay, who has questions or comments?
I feel like I missed something about the the economics of the fracking, especially with gas. And you put this slide at the end, like we're losing our shirts, we're not making any money. And you said a couple of times that they're selling gas cheaper than they're getting it. Why does fracking gas continue if it's not economically?
Excellent question. Why do these guys keep pumping gas if they're losing money? Two reasons. First reason, remember I told you about the lease. Once you sign the contract for the land, you've got to produce or you're going to lose the lease. So there's a strong incentive to produce. Actually, three reasons. Also, there's a difference between marginal cost and full cost. You can, I don't know how, I haven't looked at the numbers, but it's conceivable to me that you could be cash positive at $3 on the margin. So you're not recovering enough money to go out and buy new leases and drill new holes and so forth. But once you've got the lease and you've drilled the hole and you've all set up, at that point, financially, you're better off to sell at $3 than not to sell at all. And then the third reason is, remember I told you, we, the industry, need to maintain the pretense that this is a great business. So if you shut down and said, oh, yeah, it's going to be very hard to sell your property. So they pump. Notice from that one curve, as fast as they can, they're moving out of the gas fields and into the oil fields because oil you sell internationally and gas is trapped domestically. So they're doing everything they can to reduce their gas production, but still they're on the margin, they're producing. That's why they do it. It doesn't seem reasonable, but that's the way it is. Beth.
So this question relates to climate change. So now there are several studies, IPCC, IEA, the Carbon Tracker, that look at carbon budgets. And they base those on what are published recoverable reserves for conventional and unconventional. And you get pretty alarming figures about how much potential CO2 is in recoverable reserves. But you've dug into these numbers and maybe are skeptical about published recoverable reserves for these reasons of national security and geopolitics. So have you tried to compare your sense of the numbers with any of those reports?
So the notion here is this Bill McKibben idea that, the oil companies have all this carbon underground and they're going to be compelled to pump it out and then we're in big trouble, etc. I think that's true. The thing is, I'm speaking about my own opinion, we're already in trouble. I mean, climate change is already happening and it's already going to be serious. I don't say catastrophic, although it could be catastrophic, but we don't know that yet for sure. And so, I can talk about climate change and get off into that, but what's happening in fracking influences climate, but climate isn't influencing fracking. The people who frack basically don't care about, or don't even think about climate. The things I was talking about have their own dynamic, which are going to unfold quite independently of what you assume about climate change. So I'm not in any way refuting or arguing against this idea that there's a lot of carbon down there and we desperately need to figure out some way to prevent it coming up. It's just not what I'm looking at today. Just a minute, I'm a little hearing impaired, so I have to. Okay.
So research in renewable energies has dramatically decreased since the 2008 big shale explosion. What do you think the U.S. government needs to do in order to re-incentivize investors to
for renewable energy?
spend in renewable energy? What is, in your opinion,
So the question starts with an observation, which I haven't looked at, but I assume it's right, that the rate of construction of renewable energy has gone down in this country over the last couple of years. And what does the U.S. government or somebody have to do to make it start going back up again? Well, first of all, as you know, renewable energy is many different things. It's geothermal heat, it's firewood, it's flat plate collectors on your roof, windmills, thermal power tower. I mean, it's all these different things. And they each have their own issues. Generally speaking, and let me say, I think there's a difference fundamentally between the renewable energies that give you electricity, because by and large they feed into the grid, and the renewable technologies that give you heat, either high-grade or low-grade heat, because by and large you don't ship heat, you use it locally, and the decision-making is much more local. So there's quite a big difference. Take the electricity renewables, mainly photovoltaic and wind. A key change would be some long-term continuity for the industry. We have this preposterous situation in this country. Let me say, I'm not making judgments for the moment about whether it's good or bad. I'm just talking about how you would make it more. We have this preposterous situation in the United States where, for a variety of reasons, the Congress, mainly, votes some sort of subsidy, which is due to a lapse in 6 months from now. So you have this phenomenal burst of construction, so everybody can qualify before December 31st, and then nothing. And so one thing to do would be to start talking about 5- and 10-year programs instead of 6-month and 1-year programs. All of the other major energy sources, nuclear, I'm not sure about hydro, but nuclear and all fossil ones, enjoyed long periods of phenomenal subsidy. Still today, the oil industry receives amazing subsidies, transfers, economic transfers. It makes sense to me that we should organize to provide those subsidies also for the renewable energy industry. And it makes sense to do that. There are scale effects. When you build things on a custom basis, they're very expensive. And so you get yourself into this trap. You can't build any of these because they're too expensive, and they're so expensive because you don't build any of them. And what we need to break through that is subsidies and a guarantee so that you can build a facility that produces 10,000 of them instead of 50 of them. And once you've put the money in, then you can start to produce them at much lower level. We've seen this in some areas with photovoltaics. Photovoltaics are now grid neutral in some areas. We've had phenomenal declines in the cost of producing electricity from solar panels, to the point where now in some regions you can actually put in a photovoltaic panel and it provides power on a competitive basis. But in most cases it's not true. So we need these subsidies to build up the scale. I used to hang out with the solar lab in the old days when it was called SERI. Now it's the National Renewable Energy Lab or something like that. I saw it go from being an exciting place that had a lot of money to being basically a football, a bureaucratic football. They do stuff there, but it's low level and it's politically oriented and so forth. So we need some solid technical support. Educational programs. I told you I put a thermal array on my roof. I had enormous problems with it. I kept calling the company back, and they kept patching something on to fix it, and it just didn't work. And finally, I went to another company totally, and they sent over a solar engineer, a guy who was actually trained in the engineering of solar thermal systems. He was educated in Switzerland because he said there's no place in this country where he can get the kind of education that he has. So it would be nice to do some of that. On the heat side, here again we need technology. And training programs for the installers and those who maintain it. Subsidies. My thermal system is a total disaster, but it's less of a disaster by virtue of the fact that the state gave me a 30% subsidy on the cost, and the town gives me a break on my taxes. So stuff like that. it's absolutely doable. It's not going to solve all of our problems. I mean, there's a lot of issues there, but we could do a phenomenally better job than we are at the moment.
I want to point the attention to the messaging. So you're speaking about the big lie, and at the same time, you've been an advocate for more than 40 years about these issues. And so, who is in the best position at this time to uncover the truth? Who would the larger public opinion listen to at this point?
So the question, it's an interesting question. Who if we're running this thing on a lie or a set of lies, it's actually not a big lie, it's a lot of little ones, but if we're running it on that, and the consequences of this fracking fantasy are bad for the country, which I believe they are, how could we, where can we get some truth in here? It's always a difference between speaking theoretically and speaking practically. There are a few independent media, relatively independent. New York Times did a feature on fracking. It was, pillared for it. I mean, what they said basically the things I'm saying. It's not economically attractive. I think, the people who have the biggest incentive to know the truth are the investors. Not Wall Street, not the banks. They just like to churn deals. But the guys who are actually putting their money into it. They're starting to understand. I mean, the last few slides I showed you, these are people who are coming to understand that this is not a bonanza. So I think the truth is coming out. Getting the truth out is at the moment not my big priority. It's coming. I think within 2 or 3 years it's going to be pretty clear. Also, the production base is collapsing out from under rapidly enough. I have been focusing my efforts, my personal efforts recently, on avoiding the spread of this to other countries. So last month I was in Germany. I had a meeting with a bunch of financial journalists just talking about the numbers. And as soon as somebody who doesn't have a vested interest in it starts digging, the data are there. So it's coming. I'm not too worried about that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering what gives you the most hope.
I'm sorry. Say it. Okay.
What gives you the most hope?
What gives me the most hope? Well, I'll permit me to be a little philosophical with a question like that. So I got into this business back in 1972, and I have spent 40 years talking about these things, and without actually a lot of positive feedback. And I remember going to Paul Ehrlich, who had just before my book came out had written Population Bomb, and I said to him, Paul, how do you stay sane under these circumstances? And he said, compartmentalize. So you can talk about the global problems, but then have something down here where you can be really good and everybody thinks you're great and nobody criticizes you. So he studies butterflies. He's one of the world's leading, whatever you are when you study butterflies. Lepidopterist. Yeah, so he's one of the world's leading lepidopterists, and he contributes to that field, and he has a great time there. I'm a gardener. I have a garden, and actually I run community gardens. I organize big group gardening efforts, and it never fails to make me happy and hopeful. I have all sorts of hopes for the new gardening season.
I would like to conclude on this positive note, and I invite anyone who wants to speak with Dennis to come right down here.
Yeah.